Nazira Karimi is a journalist, television presenter, author, and entrepreneur from Afghanistan, who is currently based in Washington. Before Kabul's fall, she reported for outlets including Afghanistan National Radio and TV, the BBC, and Voice of America. Nazira now owns and manages NK Media, a futuristic multimedia house for the Afghan community around the world. Mustafa Kazemi is a veteran war correspondent with more than a decade of reporting experience in Afghanistan for outlets including Radio Free Europe, Sky News, Business Insider, and AFP. He also served in the Afghan Special Forces. Mustafa and his family evacuated to Virginia following the Taliban takeover. And finally, Rebecca Blumenstein is the deputy managing editor of the New York Times. Among her many responsibilities, she led the effort to relocate and resettle more than 200 current and former Afghan colleagues and their families following the American withdrawal. Prior to joining Times, she worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Tampa Tribune, Gannett Newspapers, and Newsday. Thank you all so much for being here. For our viewers watching at home, if you'd like to submit a question for one of our panelists, send an email to members@press.org and include Afghanistan in the subject line. Again, that's members@press.org. We'll take as many questions as time permits. So with that, Zara, let me start with you. How would you describe the state of journalism in Afghanistan today?
Well, thank you so much for having me and give me this opportunity. I would like to start my discussion with a quote from my colleagues who are remaining in Afghanistan. They said, "We love our job, but we were facing too many restrictions in the country." Unfortunately now, the media and journalists, they are facing too many challenges in the country. So it's very sad to say that now half of the media outlets were closed, and they ceased their operation. So that's very sad. So, but fortunately, still, I'm working as an Afghan journalist in exile, and I have my own team, my own colleagues who are remaining in Afghanistan. I'm sure that they are very brave, and they have a lots of interesting for doing journalism in these days. So we are working with our colleagues from different provinces of Afghanistan, and every day we have stories. Right now, unfortunately, my country is full of stories, but all of these stories is sadness, and it's heartbreaking. So now it's a very good point that still some of Afghan media in exile working and trying to amplify the voice of people of Afghanistan.
Thanks, Zara. Mustafa, maybe I'll go to you next. Talk a bit more about how media freedom in today's Afghanistan compares to reporting in pre-Taliban rule.
Thank you for having me, Elizabeth, and I thank the National Press Club for hosting this discussion. To say that there are struggles ahead of Afghan media and journalists right now, that is, I would say, it is an understatement. If you know about how the nature of Afghan media was before the fall of the country on August 15th last year, you would pretty much know the difference. But for the record, nearly half the media outlets have closed down. As the Reporters Without Borders put it, more than 60% of journalists from Afghanistan are lost. There have been deaths. There have been a very large number of them fled to outside countries, including neighboring Pakistan and Iran. And there has been a budget cut. A lot of donors have discontinued funding of various Afghan media outlets because they would not be able to report as freely as they were mandated by their donors prior to the collapse of Afghanistan. When on August 15, the city of Kabul fell, that was when everybody realized that there's going to be one of the major damages to the country on the side of the various other factors is the freedom of media. As whoever lived in Afghanistan or is aware of the history, in the first time that the Taliban took over the country back in '95, if I'm not mistaken, there was pretty much several cases of violence against foreign journalists, let alone Afghan journalists. It has been a trend for the Taliban to disallow any flow of accurate information from Afghanistan, mainly from mainstream media channels. They have attempted a couple of times to block social media websites such as Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms that actually get the news out to the world of what is happening on the ground. Those were futile attempts, but what they have done is that they have pretty much suppressed the media outlets that are currently operating in Afghanistan. What is happening if you compare the broadcasts on broadcast journalism or the print in Afghanistan, there's a change of contrast, there's change of tone in whatever is being reported. The same media that were calling the Taliban a terrorist group, a designated terrorist group prior to August 15 collapse of the country, are now forcefully, absolutely not willfully, addressing the Taliban as de facto governors of the country. This is because they wish to keep their media operation running, but they do not have a choice of reporting as free and up to whatever standards that they were following prior to the collapse of the Taliban. One thing that has been lost is the freedom of speech. If you open any Afghan website, Afghan news website, or watch any of the broadcasts happening from Afghanistan, you do not see anything under the name of free press. You do not see a piece of news that you can call this a factually healthy piece of information that can be translated into news. It is either biased titles and names, prejudiced because nobody wants to address the Taliban in any way, because it has happened in various cases that they have called the Taliban a group and not a government or any party ruling the country. Within the next coming hours, the Taliban have raided their stations, they have arrested their staff members, they have beaten some of the journalists, some of the TV anchors and presenters, and pretty much in various cases, they have set an example that if you talk against us or if you talk in a different contrast than what we expect you to talk about us, what you broadcast about us, you will pretty much get the beating within the next hour. This has stopped for the sake of safety of journalists in Afghanistan since January 1st. And pretty much every media working in Afghanistan, they have changed how they broadcast or print the news in Afghanistan. It is just, whatever is being reported is probably partially factually correct, not entirely, because they have to lean on not putting a negative tone to the Taliban or giving him a negative contrast. I would like to categorize the media outlets currently working in Afghanistan into three groups. Before the collapse of Taliban, there were a number of media outlets that were pro-Taliban, and because of the freedom of speech and the freedom of broadcast back then, they could openly express their pro-Taliban opinions and discuss and address that group in any particular way that they preferred to, giving them respect, giving them credit for attacking the international peacekeeping forces, the NATO, the American forces, and glorifying what the Taliban were doing. This used to happen before collapse of the country on August 15. After the collapse, the number of media outlets that actually became more bold in terms of broadcasts, they received more freedom, They did not face any threats from the government or the army or any other institution they used to regulate the media. This category of media outlets became more bold. They started broadcasting with absolute freedom. They received more funding and are now the prime, I would say, broadcasters because they have the group, the Taliban group, on their side, an institution that they used to defend for several years. On the other side, we have the category of, I would say, relatively standard or moderate media in Afghanistan. They used to criticize pretty much every party. If it was the Afghan government, if it was the Haqqani terrorist network, if it was the Taliban network, they used to criticize everyone and put their factual piece of information as news with verifiable sources and verifiable information. Those category of media outlets, whoever was in that category, they're facing the majority of the damage that is being caused and has been happening up to this moment. They cannot report on anything against the Taliban anymore because someone will knock on their door within the next hours. And a number of them have closed down, about 43%, according to Reporters Without Borders, have closed down due to funding and due to lack of freedom of broadcast. So what happened is that now the only choice left for the media that are currently working in Afghanistan is, if you don't want to be against, if you cannot be against the Taliban and you don't want to be on their side, what you can do is stay relatively neutral. But even being relatively neutral, the Taliban will call you someone from the authorities and tell you, why are you not broadcasting any news activities, any news related to our activities? And in every bulletin, if there are 10 titles of news, you are forced at one way or another to broadcast at least one piece of news in every bulletin related to something the Taliban has done, which is, in their opinion, something positive, a positive activity. On the side of that, this is the institutional damage that has happened to the Afghan media up to now. There were 10,780 media workers in Afghanistan prior to the collapse of the country. 8,290 were men and 2,490 were women. But out of that, on December 1st, Reporters Without Borders estimate that out of the 10,700 something, only 4,360 people remain working in Afghanistan. The contacts that I have been speaking to in Afghanistan, the remaining reporters, they tell me about a situation that indicates maximum hardship and difficulty in reporting for freelance journalists. If you're attached to a broadcast station, a television, a print institution, or even a website, and you have a badge, they will relatively cut you some slack because you don't identify as yourself as a journalist. They identify you as the organization that you're actually working for. It is not like they're working with absolute freedom and they have absolute safety. There have been several arrests, beatings of journalists for reporting the women's protests against the Taliban since last year. But the most difficult situation remains for the freelance reporters. The Taliban do not have a proper understanding of how a freelance journalist work or how the realm of freelancing works and operates. If someone tells a Taliban checkpoint that he's a freelance journalist or she's a freelance journalist, they actually question him more because they start casting doubt due to their own lack of knowledge of what is freelance journalism. They're like, you do not have a badge, you do not belong to anywhere, and making them understand the idea of being a freelance journalist has proven difficult for several journalists. They have been beaten for not having a badge and not being affiliated with a media outlet, and that difficulty remains. One of the most trivial but absolutely important last matter is that the Taliban have started to pick on how media personnel who go out to the field for coverage dress themselves. They used to wear clothes relative to whatever they were covering before, up to 3-4 months into the Taliban takeover of the country. But each time they arrest someone on the side of whatever they tell them, the interrogations, the information taken from them, everything, they just tell them directly that you cannot dress with jeans or shirts or anything Western. And that is one pressure, because I was in the field for 10 years doing journalism. I know that you cannot work, absolutely not, in a pair of local clothes, and just not giving enough freedom to a journalist on how they dress themselves when doing their duty. That is, I would say, as important as telling them what to report and what not to report. They have not been scared of beating the journalists that cover mass gatherings. They have done that openly. There are evidence, pictures, and everything of that all over. But after discussing everything, I would like to say that there are still 3 journalists that are in prison since the fall of Taliban, and they pretty much do not listen to anybody. The United Nations, the NATO, neighboring countries, they do not listen to anybody, despite being several calls for their release. One thing that I would like to note is that the Taliban, they're influenced by foreign powers, foreign countries, I would say, if not powers. As long as there is a connection between this group and the government sponsoring them, there will not be an end to the persecution of media outlets in Afghanistan. There will not be a freedom of media until this group wants to do so. And until now, there's no indication that the Taliban group would want to have a moderate and, just like before, media in Afghanistan.
Thanks, Mustafa. That overview, I think, was really informative as far as the restrictions facing journalists and especially freelancers. I'm so glad you raised that. Nazira, help us understand what it's like to be a female reporter in Afghanistan right now. How have the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls made the job more difficult?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I'm really proud of these 2 young journalists. They express very well the Afghanistan situation, which is very sad. I really feel sad. But since I left Afghanistan 24 years ago, I live in the United States. I never been in person in Afghanistan, but still I like to follow up Afghanistan. And I work especially for Afghanistan. Anything happen at the United States, I cover that. Unfortunately, when I was in Afghanistan, it was Najibullah time, like 24 years ago, I started work. I was very young. I started when I was 18 with a lot of challenges. Although the government was closed, it was not freedom of speech. But still, if I compare it with this time, it's not fair. You cannot compare that time and this time. But as I told you, as long as I'm here, as Mustafa said, daily basis, every day, I get a lot of phone calls from female Afghan journalists in Afghanistan. As Mustafa and Zara said, that's true. And journalists, even sometimes they cannot explain their situation, and they have a lot of difficulty. And Taliban rules, every day they created rules toward women, especially for journalists and female journalists. Of course, it's difficult for them. They cannot raise their voice. They hide from one place to the other place. And of course, if you're not safe, if your family is not safe, how can you work? For me, my career is my life. Probably you may say that it is like profession, but for me, it's not profession. It's not job. It's my life. It's my everything as a woman journalist. Women or female journalists in Afghanistan, every day facing to negative things. Nayu and Munkar, for example, every day they created a rule. And Taliban keeps saying that we follow up Sharia law or Sharia law. I don't know which kind of model of Islam or Sharia law Taliban use, especially regarding women in Afghanistan. And that's why, based off my contact, can you believe it or not, every day, one part of my job and my life is answer the phone in Afghanistan. Some of them, they cry and everything. And it's really difficult for me at their expectation that Nazira, please save our life. Please save our family's life, because I have access to the White House. I have access to the Pentagon, State Department, and I cannot do anything. I feel so sorry about myself and about women in Afghanistan that I cannot do anything. But one time I raised my voice, I appeal on the Taliban, our international community, to help Afghan people generally, especially Afghan female journalists, because it's really difficult for them. Although we have very, very brave women in Afghanistan, they also fight against their rights. I know that. I believe that we have a very rich history in Afghanistan, and everybody know that. But I have a point that why international community, why the United States Authority, didn't, or they are not able to get a strong decision to do something. Afghan female journalists are all Afghan people, because nowadays economy crisis, poverty, it's not only journalists. Everybody, especially young generation, they are under a lot of bad situation, and Taliban should know that. And their expectation, they have a high expectation from me and from the United States, that United States should make decision and bring a little power of pressure to the Taliban to change their situation. Otherwise, United States is a powerful country, NATO, international community, as Mustafa said. I think they should make a decision, because this is very darkness time for Afghan people, especially Afghan female journalists.
Thank you, Nazira. And I do want to talk more about how the international community and foreign governments can be doing more to help. But first, Rebecca, let's talk about how the New York Times has changed the way it reports on the ground in Afghanistan. What are some of the new security policies the paper has had to adopt? And how has the risk calculus shifted for editors and reporters as they think about what stories are worth pursuing in Afghanistan right now?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm simply honored to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues from Afghanistan in the press. It's just the struggles that you have gone through, and I would say, as a journalist, but particularly as female Afghan journalists, I just am in awe of, and have learned a tremendous amount about myself over the past years since the fall of Kabul. I mean, we and other international organizations faced a unique challenge, because when Kabul fell so suddenly on that day, many of our people were deemed to be at extreme risk because they had worked for Western news organizations. So we and others launched efforts to try to evacuate as many as possible. And we were ultimately successful in doing so. And many of us took a route, but there were many different routes to accomplish this. Some ended up in Pakistan, some ended up in Australia. A good number ended up via Qatar in Mexico City, where many may not realize, but journalists from news organizations from NPR, CBS, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal have been waiting, in a sense, to figure out where they go next. We got a group of 124 into Houston, and then the rest of the 200 who we evacuated, there was a program jointly run by the U.S. State Department, and many of them have now settled in Canada. That then leaves us with as you point out, like how to cover Afghanistan. And I don't want to get into security questions in particular in great detail, because obviously they're sensitive, but we feel a great commitment to cover Afghanistan. We feel a great commitment to the story. Obviously, this was very much in the news, and I say really resonated, I think, a year ago with the fall of Kabul, with a lot in the U.S. at least, a lot of very difficult questions about the role of the U.S., the complicity of the U.S., the obligation of the U.S. There was high interest in this topic. But I think we've seen the economy, Ukraine, and so many other things that have happened to a certain extent. Reader interest has moved on, but we are, and anyone who covers this is very committed to continuing to cover the story. We are also very careful. We don't want to recreate a bureau that we just sadly had to. We had a bureau in Kabul for 20 years. We can't really recreate the same thing there, given the dangers. So what we're doing is a combination of things, which I think most organizations are doing, of of keeping our reporters on Afghanistan, of having them do some reporting out of the country, but then once we figure out that there's a safe opportunity, also very much committed to going in and reporting on the ground. And I would also just like to note that one very interesting question I think facing all of us moving forward is the role of the many Afghan journalists who are now out of the country, like some of you, and the role that they play in future reporting. I think it may be quite large. There are certainly hurdles. There's nothing, as we all know, to be like being on the ground, and we have to work very carefully with freelancers and do whatever we can to protect them. But it's also quite striking that with current technologies, that we can and we have continued to report what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, outside of Afghanistan, and I think a question facing the many Afghan reporters who are out of the country right now is, will that be viable? Will that be economically viable? What will news organizations do? Will there be different kinds of wire services, or different? Is there a world where we see a new model, in a sense, of reporting in war zones that explicitly includes people who are not in the country? And is that something that will keep people employed and is more than just an occasional freelance opportunity? I could see something like that. And among the journalism schools that have taken graciously fellows in Afghan journalists, there's the beginnings of talk of what that would look like, because otherwise they will need to find jobs elsewhere. And that could be another loss to the reporting community that's so committed to covering what's happening in Afghanistan.
Zara, I'd love to get your take on this. How has your experience been reporting in exile, and do you see that as a model going forward?
Well, thank you so much. First, I'm gonna to share general information about the situation of journalists and media. According to the report of Afghanistan Journalist Center, that during 1 year, at least 245 cases of violence against journalists happened. And due to the lack of funding, nearly 600 media outlets have ceased operation. And at least 130 media workers and journalists have been detained, and at least 80 journalists have been threatened. 25 have been physically assaulted. So that's but unfortunately, according to your questions, it's much more difficult to work as a journalist in exile. It is very important, I think, the journalists being on the ground, because you have a lot of information. You can contact to local source. You can when you be in this inside of the country, you have access to information. So, but when you are outside, here is much more difficult to work as journalist. According my experience for 1 year, however, right now in my country, it's only just one option that the people have, that which is media. They have every day they are raising their voice. They want the people, they are trying to share their stories with us. So that's very difficult. My team and inside who are remaining in the country, they are working and hiding, and they don't have access to information. So that's very difficult.
Nazira, Afghanistan's journalists have remained defiant in the face of so many restrictions imposed by the Taliban. Describe that resistance, and how are journalists on the ground in Afghanistan pushing back on this crackdown on press freedom?
Good question. Thank you very much. As I told you before, Afghan woman is very brave. Afghan journalist is very brave. If I bring me as an example, that I was 19 years old, 20, I don't want to say my age anyway, don't ask about that. But I remember that one day I reported from Kabul city, 4,000 or more than 4,000 plane rockets came or landed to Kabul, beautiful city. And that one was, I don't want to mention the name. Of course, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the leader of the Mujahideen. And that time I resisted and I continued to work, although my colleagues said, don't go because rockets came systematically. Maybe you die, you are single, Nazira. But my cameraman said, I am married, I have 4 children, I don't want to be die. And I say, no, because of my people, I have to go to there. When I remember those dark times, I feel sad because why Afghan people suffer? Every day, every year, it's kind of game or what? For a while we be okay, and then game started again and we backward. But as you mentioned, Afghan women, Afghan people, they are very brave. They standing and they fight for their right. You see every day, Afghan women raise their voices, as Zara said, although they hide themselves. And this morning, a journalist, female journalist called me and said, Nazira, please don't mention my name. And Taliban came and took my brother for investigation. And she's not feeling okay that Taliban took her brother away. How can she report it? But still hidely, she reported me. She explained the situation in Afghanistan. But they are very brave journalists. They are very brave. They continue to fight for their rights. And we are here like Zara, like Mustafa. We have many, many journalists. Fortunately, during the evacuation, so many journalists fortunately left Afghanistan. But the sad things, all those journalists they left behind in Afghanistan, most of them, the evacuation process was not fairly. Was a big mistake of the United States. I was here 2-3 days systematically. The people came. I'm happy for them because Afghanistan not safe for no one. But the real people like journalists, like artists, like singers, like human rights activists, most of them, SIV, even SIV people, the people who work with the United States, with the Afghan, with the American as a friend, they are left behind in Afghanistan, but still Afghan people, they are, they are very brave. They try to fight, and they are standing for their rights. This is my knowledge that I know. Otherwise, I don't know, international community watch people, watching women, how brave they are. But I'm surprised that what will be the final solution for how long we suffer. As I told you and I explained my history when I was 18 years old. I remember we grew up during the war. War will continue. I know this is a region country, neighbor country. I need to add something. Pakistan is our neighbor. Iran is our neighbor. But they all, interfere to my country. This is the reason. But I hope today we get conclusion and find some solution for those problems for Afghan people, generally, not only journalists.
Mustafa, you're among the thousands of Afghans who fled the country last year. What was the process like of resettling in the United States? And do you have any thoughts on improving it specifically for journalists?
It has been, excuse me, it has been more than a nightmare. The facilities and the ease of operation, the ease of life that is there in Afghanistan for you and the minimum amount of hard working that is required to have a relatively normal life with everything on just a standard level compared to their end here for Afghans to say as a refugee, as a journalist, even if you worked with the US military, if you worked with any media outlets of the US government or private outlets, it has been more than a nightmare. I worked over 10 years in the media, over 8 years in the special forces. And right now I'm working in a store. This is in light of what is happening inside the United States. The domestic news is it is busy, and there are things happening that belong to the U.S. and I cannot expect something out of the whatever is the national crisis, I would say, to be taken out and then someone pays attention to me or the likes of me. But this is, I mentioned this because there's still room, a lot of opportunities. There are various reporters here, professional A-grade reporters that can actually be employed either on part-time or full-time basis. And they can actually provide you a lot of input. Rebecca would know that if you are, if you expect a US-based reporter to write a piece for you about an incident of abuse against a journalist in Kabul, and then you compare it with a piece of news that is written by an Afghan who actually has been there, and he would probably feel if the person was beaten, he would feel the pain here. You would actually see the difference. I mentioned this because when you're writing about an incident far away in the field, it would be better in the words of someone who has been there. And you have a lot of people like that. They're doing produce, they wash dishes, they're working in stores like me, they're doing cabs, but they're professional reporters who used to produce at least 5 long form pieces when they were in Afghanistan. It's not like it's going to need like 5 editor polish after they write it. But the process of integrating people like me, reporters, into the American society as reporters, it is not as easy as I would discuss it here. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of rigorous background checks, the employment, the hiring, everything. But it is not like there's no way to take care of that. I know there are various openings for journalists in the U.S., especially the East Coast, because there are a lot of reporters that I know they're resettled here. But getting them employed into a media outlet, I would say it's not 100% difficult and it's not 100% easy. It is a 50-50 deal. A news outlet would have to decide between 25 applicants with 10 plus years of experience covering everything in the US, and then against that would be one Afghan that has covered Afghanistan and the region for 10 years. You obviously don't want to have someone that is not familiar with what the Congress does. They're not familiar with what the federal government does. You want someone to report on pretty much everything. But when you get that all in one person, you lose the essence of whatever you're writing. It will be like a robot typing whatever is happening, putting facts all together as bulletins and descriptions, and it will be news. But if you put someone, if you put a congressional reporter to cover the Congress, or you put an Afghan reporter who's been there to cover what is happening in Kabul, for example, or up north, you will have that essence that the reader actually enjoys reading that piece, because this author, this writer, whoever's writing it, is dedicated, has the knowledge, will put minor details, and will give you trivial information that would actually, how to say it, beautify whatever piece you're trying to publish and feed to your audiences. Like I said, the process of getting the reporters back to the media, it has been very ill organized. There are ways to use whoever is here, reporters, because their background, you can interview them and you will potentially know how to use them. there are a lot of freelancers in Kabul. Uh, there are ways to put them to work. They do not have an income, but they're a good source of information. I know people who have, they can probably get you a piece of news if it's like 1 o'clock in the morning in Kabul and you need it for breaking news over here. And I would doubt if a US based reporter would be able to pull that piece of information for your breaking news lead at 1 o'clock in the morning Kabul time. So I have a series of suggestions for how to improve the overall media situation in Afghanistan. Of course, it depends on how viable it is through governments and how possible it is and how wanted and willfully if someone is trying to actually improve the situation. Um, there is no committee or group or anything to oversight what is happening against the remaining journalists inside Afghanistan. There's nobody questioning the Taliban, and there's nobody calling on them about what is happening directly and then following up on it. The Taliban do not listen to nonprofit organizations. If the NPC calls for release of an arrested journalist, or the Reporters Without Borders, or for example, the New York Times calls for release of one of their freelancers, if there are any, it's not like the Taliban will pay any attention or care for that. You need an authentic and very powerful committee uh, consisted of government members, international community, to oversight on what the Taliban are doing and hold them accountable for case by case basis. If you beat a journalist for doing his job, there should be someone to question the regime in a week or less about what they did. That establishes a sort of protocol for the Taliban that if you keep doing this, the amount of dollar money flowing into Kabul, it will decrease. You will have limitations on your cellular phone use. You will have limitations on your leaders traveling abroad. You will have serious restrictions, pertaining to your governance or whatever you're trying to rule the country. There are no talks, to my best knowledge. Nobody's speaking to the Taliban right now on behalf of the media or for the media. There should be a group, there should be a point of contact uh, to the knowledge of everyone to speak to the Taliban, defend the journalists' right with them, and discuss everything on case by case basis. It cannot happen if one congressman or someone from a non-profit calls one of the Taliban leaders and says, "Hey, stop abusing the journalists, let them do their jobs." It cannot happen that way. You have to have a system, you have to have a protocol, and go through that. And most importantly, every abuse needs to be documented. Just like the pictures go out on social media, it should get archived somewhere. What happened, why it happened, what are the current evidences, if there are illustrations, if there are photographs, if there are voice clips, whatever. It should be documented because sooner or later, these people will stand before a court. And if you do not document this, just like some of the Nazi commanders, these people will go without, being held accountable for what they're doing right now. Uh, there's no diplomatic pressure. It's just calls through the media. Nobody is actually directly engaging with the Taliban to say, "Hey, do not do this," or this will be the repercussion. If you do not let the journalists do their work, the repercussion will be, cutting your budget or cutting whatever access you have to Arabic countries, restrictions on travels. All this needs to be put in place. For a crime, there needs to be a punishment. And currently, to my best knowledge, the Taliban are not being they're not being given any response to whatever they're doing in Kabul. It is a totalitarian regime. If they feel like pulling a journalist out of their house 2 o'clock in the morning, they do so without being scared of anybody. That is because there's no systematic channel to follow up, to hold them accountable, to document everything, and to tell them that you cannot do this. This is wrong, and there will be repercussions if you do that. Uh, just one more suggestion: the media outlets that actually cover Afghanistan, they have a way of hiring the Afghan reporters that are here to their knowledge and to their usefulness as part-time contributors. You can have them write anything or report anything, or pull information from Kabul through their sources, and you do not have a liability to have them on a full-time contract. They're by the DHS, Homeland Security. They're most of them, 90%, are authorized to work in the U.S. And in my opinion, if someone stands up, makes a pool, brings all the journalists together, and sort of puts everyone in a place like pieces of puzzle, I think there will be an increase in quality and quantity of reporting from Afghanistan. But this is in light of whatever's happening domestically in the US, whatever's happening in Ukraine, whatever's happening in Africa. And one cannot expect that 100% of the news flow in the US belongs to one place. People might not care what is happening in Kabul, but I know in Texas, if there's a ban on abortion, it matters, and it goes on nationwide broadcasts. And with that balance being taken into account, US-based media can absolutely use whoever reporters, whatever number of them are here, to their best knowledge and to their best use. And of course, the government is going to appreciate that. It's not like the media care for what the federal government might say or might not, but it is a good chance for them, because if you hire someone who was a freelancer back in Kabul, you work with them 2 years here. In the third year, you will have a grade A reporter who can actually file long forms for you, let alone having, one of them who used to do long forms in Kabul, hire him here.
We have a handful of audience questions, including one that I think picks up nicely from your point there, Mustafa. So Rebecca, how can Western news organizations support their former Afghan colleagues?
It's an excellent question. Look, I think this is settling out, and Mustafa raises some very, very important points. Western news organizations can continue the relationship with their journalists. They can help them get into fellowships and programs at universities if there are some language issues. It's I think that we all have to realize, and Mustafa, your poignant points about how you're an experienced journalist and you're working in a store right now is, it's really, really gut wrenching to have to go through the experience, I can imagine, of starting over. And I think we all realize that the trajectory of life in the U.S. will be altered if people like you and people with, quite frankly, English skills that are inferior to yours get some support and education. I think we all have to realize that this is the biggest influx of refugees since the Vietnam War. And quite frankly, some universities and organizations have stepped up, and institutions, and some haven't. And there's a whole generation now of people here, including journalists, but far beyond that, young people who are incredibly ambitious and who will end up working in stores and warehouses and pretty low-level jobs until we quite urgently get them the help and support they need. And that includes rigorous and academic English training. There's no question, Mustafa has mentioned a couple times, American journalism itself is struggling right now. Major news organizations are laying off. Tens of thousands of reporters have lost their jobs in the past decade. And so to a certain extent, it's not a great scenario for a huge influx of new journalists here, but there are ways. And in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, which is itself gone through many evolutions, hired one of our Afghan journalists to be a reporter on the ground here in Pittsburgh. And I think all news organizations need to ask themselves what they can do to help these people who have a lot to offer, and not just, certainly can be very critical in helping us continue to cover Afghanistan at this moment, but also are great reporters in general. And we need to do, as schools and universities, really rise to the challenge. Mustafa, a couple other things I'm just concerned by, and I think would help with this, is that international foundations apparently have pulled back from supporting media in Afghanistan, and what is not helping right now, which is the understandable pressure upon nonprofits, international funders to pull back because of what the Taliban is doing. But what the effect of it is of course the terribly concerning conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. Winter's coming, hunger, all the reports that we're seeing. But it's withdrawing support from people when they need it most. I've been impressed by the American University of Afghanistan, which is continuing to educate women and young people in Afghanistan, even remotely. And we're going to need a lot of creativity to support those who are there and those who are here.
We have a few more audience questions. I think maybe Zara, I'll go to you with this one. How are people inside Afghanistan getting independent news, if at all?
Thank you for the questions. I think the media and the journalists who remain in the country, who are in the ground, for them it's very difficult to find an independent news or independent story, because the Taliban, they will the journalists, they will arrest the journalists and they will torture. So, and there is a lots of restriction and limitation on the media who are working in the inside of the country. So right now, all of the media outlets inside the country, they have to call Taliban as Amarat Islamic government. And they have to, before to publish a story, the Taliban, they will check this. It's very normal now for the Taliban, because they asked the journalists before you want to publish the story, send us for check, and we have to correct this news for you, which is happened with my colleagues months ago. So unfortunately now, except the media who are working in exile, the others outlet media, they are not independent. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have their freedom. So that's very difficult, and that's very darkness moments actually.
Nazira, this one's for you. One of our Sri Lankan press club members asks, what can regional South Asian nations do to assist Afghan journalists on press freedom?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Afghan freelance, Afghan women, all female journalists need a lot of assistance. They have a different ways, including the international community, United States, anywhere. They have a different opportunity and different ways to help them. I think the best way, number one, they should be care about them that they live in Afghanistan. Or also one thing that it's really bothering me, Taliban welcoming to the foreign journalists. When the foreign journalists go to Afghanistan, Taliban welcome them, and the local journalists, they are under a lot of pressure. If they find some solution to bring pressure to Taliban to change their policy toward Afghan female journalists in Afghanistan, I think this is the best way. Although U.S. Representative Tom West or Mrs. Amiri, Rina Amiri, represent Afghan women in Afghanistan, they should talk seriously with the Taliban. Repeatedly, they go to Doha and they discuss about Afghanistan situation, especially Banu Amiri, Mrs. Amiri has responsibility. She needs to talk with everybody, including United States and NATO allies, international community, to find solution to, help Afghan journalists from different way. Either if they are not able to bring them at the United States, they should establish, like before, foreign media established so many courses, computers, like any other training courses for the local media. They can do it and, continue and watch them from here. They have a different way to help Afghan women and Afghan female journalists.
Great. Mustafa, I think we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to go to you with this last one. If you could say one thing to the people of Afghanistan about a free news media, our questioner wants to know, what would you want to tell them? We just have a few minutes. I'll go to you.
It's really difficult to make that judgment or tell people, what to believe, what not to believe. The only thing that I would tell them is that use your common sense for whatever news you read or watch on the TV. And that should be with the current situation on the ground on your mind, because what is happening, not every single, probably half the news that is being broadcast is being vetted by the Taliban before going out. So that should pretty much tell you everything. Do not believe everything, but do not disbelieve everything. Use common sense, and that should be your best judge to, see if the news is balanced or not.
Zara, do you want to pick up on that? Do you have any messages to your journalist colleagues on the ground in Afghanistan?
Thank you so much. Just I want to say that the journalists who are remaining on the ground, they are very brave. They are the real journalists who are working this crisis situation. Unfortunately, now this Afghanistan situation is just the women protesters called hell. I believe that this is the same. So I tell them that please continue your work as a journalist. It is very important. It is not only for now, it's for history. And you will record all the things that the Taliban are doing and right now that the other groups are doing right now. And we will use in the future, we will use it in the history.
And Rebecca, I'll bring you in. Any final thoughts?
I'm very inspired by those words, and I think that I would just reinforce them. I mean, the people on the ground in Afghanistan, the journalists on the ground need our support. They're doing such a vital function to continue bringing the story of what's happening on the ground to the rest of the world. We should do whatever we can to support them. I'm inspired by Mustafa's observation that there really isn't a cohesive force or organized force among news organizations advocating for press freedom in Afghanistan. And that's a takeaway that I've gained from this discussion. And I think we do need to, as tough as it is, to talk in a more unified way to the Taliban and to other Western organizations that support press freedoms, to see what we can do to increase the pressure to protect and do whatever we can to protect the brave journalists on the ground in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
With that, we are running out of time here. So I just want to thank all of you for a really engaging discussion. I too am inspired by all of your work. And I also like to thank the National Press Club's International Correspondents Committee.
Can I add something else?
Nazir, we have about 1 minute. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I need to add something. Like a year ago, I was at the White House it was briefing news conference of President Biden, and I get the opportunity to ask question. And I asked President Biden that President, Afghan women had a lot of achievement during this 20 years. Of course, thank you very much for your service. Now it's not the time that you leave Afghanistan and you leave alone Afghan people, especially Afghan women. President Biden answered me. He was very generous. He talked, a story, very sad story. And he said when he was in Afghanistan, long time ago, he faced so many Afghan children. And President Biden said, I told them that we are here to fight against Al-Qaeda and terrorists. And that's why we came to Afghanistan. And he said, 2-3 children, they are 7 or 8 years old. And they asked President Biden that please don't go, don't leave us alone because we have hope. We want to be a doctor, engineer, lawyer. And that's why this is our hope for future. Please don't leave alone Afghan people, stay with us. And President Biden said, I feel very sad. And that's why I remember that story. And that's why we are staying in Afghanistan. And I asked him, President, now the time, why you leave Afghanistan? Those people want to be a doctor and engineer, and you didn't keep your commitment. And he said, this is the time that we leave. It was very sad and very negative memory for me. I just wanted to share with my friend too. And again, I really request and raise my voice one more time for United States and international community to keep their commitment and continue help Afghan people, although they do under humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. But as people said, this money go through to the Taliban pocket. Afghan people never use that. You're the witness that anything happened in Afghanistan, but Afghan people are still, they are under bad situation, economic crisis. Everybody know about that. Just I begging and I ask international community and United States to keep the commitment. Let them, those kids become a doctor, engineer, lawyer, because kids today, they are future, they make future in Afghanistan. That's my message to the United States.
And thank you for sharing, Nazira. I think it's a powerful message to end on. Again, I'd like to thank the National Press Club and specifically members Zach Cohen, Produce Al Farouk, and Rachel Oswald for organizing today's event. And we hope you'll join us at our next event on Wednesday, August 31st, when we host the annual National Press Club Journalism Awards dinner featuring this year's award recipients. Club President Jen Judson will be honoring the late Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh with the President's Award. Tickets are on sale at press.org. Thank you again to all of the panelists and to our audience for watching today and for your questions. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Khuda Hafiz.
Bye.
Allah Hafiz.